So we're going to look at some charts that have Rahu in the second house and look at the dashas of Rahu and perhaps Ketu as well. So Rahu in the second house in this person's chart, we've looked at this chart a little bit. First of all, Rahu in the second house tends to be a tough dasha. It's not nice to have Rahu in the second or eighth. And the reason is because Rahu is just so capable of undermining our security, financially, materially, and also emotionally. It can destroy everything we depend on emotionally and materially. And those are the second and eighth houses. Okay? And so whenever you see Rahu in those houses, it can get very difficult. They're definitely difficult houses to have Rahu in general. Okay? And this person's chart's just not going to be any exception to that rule. So first we see that Rahu's in the second house. So what are the important lords going to be? What important antardashas? Well, based on the Rashi, Rahu Mars will be important because Rahu rules Mars rules Rahu. Rahu Jupiter will be important because it's conjunct Jupiter. And Rahu Saturn will be important because Rahu Saturn's always important. So those are three important Vargas that we see here. Okay? Or three important, antardashas. Jupiter, Mars, Saturn. And then, of course, Rahu Venus is always going to be important as well. So that's 4 out of the 5 antardashas we've already got worked out, which are going to be critical and important to look at. And as we look towards other Vargas, we might find, other very important planets. Okay? So what Vargas do we have to look at? Well, we have to pay a lot of attention to the second Varga, the Hora, because of the fact that the Hora is the Varga of the second Bhava. Okay? Here we see Rahu's in the sign of Venus. So that means Rahu Venus will be really important for financial things during Rahu Dasha. So now we have another focus on that Antardasha. Okay? Then the other important Varga, well, Rahu's conjunct Jupiter. So that tells us to go to the Saptamsha, right? Of course, we had to go to the Saptamsha anyway for children. We always want to go to Saptamsha for Rahu Dasha because it can give children. But this chart's particularly true so because of the fact that Rahu's conjunct Jupiter, the Karka of children. In that chart, Rahu's in the sign of Venus. So again, Rahu Venus is going to continue to be a very important period. Okay? So it looks like those are going to be likely the most important periods. Okay? So let's take a look at this person's life. Okay. Rahu starts. All right. How's Rahu himself going to manage things? Let's take a look at Rahu. Rahu's aspected by the Sun to 15 points, who's an evil house lord. So that's not going to make Rahu totally open to developing resources and finances. It's not a good house lord. It's aspected by its own lord, which is a good thing, Mars. Unfortunately, Mars is sleeping and not going to be able to help him out. It's aspected by Mercury to 10 points. Mercury is a productive opening house lord for Libra Lagna, so that'll help it. It's aspected by Venus, but Venus is sleeping, so that's not helping it. So it's about a mixed influence to Rahu. Oh, and then the conjunction of Jupiter, of course, who's the 3rd and 6th lord from the Lagna, difficult house lord. So Rahu is not real open to them developing their own resources and self-sufficiency. Okay, it's not real good at that. Okay, in general. So that lets us know in Rahu period, this person was struggling financially. Okay, that was a young period in their life, the age of 18 to about 19 years of age or so. Okay, and that was a period where they were out of high school. They were sort of squandering their time through college without really a lot of focus of ever wanting to get done with college. Okay? Then Rahu Jupiter comes on, and now this could be a potentially extremely important period because, like as we talked about, Jupiter is conjunct Rahu. So we have to look at the Hora chart. And in the Hora chart, Rahu, Jupiter, well, how's Jupiter doing there? Jupiter's sleeping in the horror chart, okay? It's aspected by the Sun, who's in its own natural or a friend sign to 17 points, so he gets help from Jupiter. He gets help from Mars to 21 points. Mars is in Sagittarius, a natural friend's house, so it's helping the Sun. Mercury's neutral, so it won't help or hinder. Venus is an enemy of the Sun but debilitated. Or excuse me, an enemy of Jupiter but debilitated. And also, even though Jupiter's sleeping, he's Lord, Venus is debilitated and so can't hurt him very much. So Jupiter's actually in okay shape in the horror chart. So Rahu Jupiter helps this person start earning more, and it does it through Jupiterian means. They actually start hosting a daycare service in their house and making money through that. Okay? So one Varga is taken care of. We also have to look at the Rashi chart and see that Jupiter is the 6th Lord. Okay? So that shows possibilities of Rahu Jupiter bringing in some possible health problems or debts and finances. Okay? Well, we've seen Jupiter's pretty good in the horror chart, so it doesn't look like too many debts to be expecting. Okay? And in the horror chart, Jupiter happens to rule the 9th house, a favorable open house. So when it comes to Jupiter's Antardasha, he's not going to really hurt Rahu financially. So it's a better time financially. Then we want to look at the 30th Varga to see what Jupiter's doing there. See, because Rahu, is this going to bring any health ramifications? Well, in this chart, Jupiter's in its own sign. Okay? So that shows great health during Rahu Dasha. Or during Jupiter Dasha. Or Rahu Jupiter, okay? So we don't have to have any health concerns. The health is fine. No worries there. Okay, since it's Jupiter, we have to pay attention to children. And since it's Jupiter in a woman's chart, we also have to pay attention to the Navamsha for marriage and see what they're doing there. And of course, Rahu can give marriage any time. And it can give marriage in its dasha. So the 7th has to do with both. The 7th Varga has to do with both what's the word I'm using? The 7th Varga has to do with both relationships, intercourse, and children. So it's always an important Varga for seeing when people start having an intimate relationship with another person and possibly when they will conceive a child. Rahu in this chart's sitting pretty good. It's in sign of Libra. Its ruler Venus is exalted. Okay, and it's Rahu, which can always get you to have intercourse with people and give children. So obviously Rahu Dasha is going to have some important significations in respect to children and in respect to relationships. Okay, Rahu also rules the 9th Bhavaka, or I'm sorry, gives effects of Venus, who's the 9th Bhavaka Lord, which specifically has to do with children. Okay, so we can see in Rahu Dasha there's certainly going to be some children happening because of that nice Lord of Rahu in the Saptamsha. Well, let's get back to Rahu Jupiter. Jupiter, which is getting activated in Rahu's Dasha via the Saptamsha. Jupiter is difficult house lord. He rules the 11th and Rashi from the ascendant. He is in Scorpio, a natural friend sign, but his friend Mars is sleeping over here. So that weakens Jupiter's ability to grant children, okay? Then Jupiter is aspected by its strong friend, the Sun, which is good. That will help maintain consistency in relationships. And in the Saptamsha chart, the 7th cusp Lord Sun is always a critical, important planet. It's aspected by Mars, who's sleeping, his enemy Mercury, who's taken some wind out of it, and his enemy Venus, who's exalted. So Jupiter's really trashed. Okay? Jupiter is just not going to be able to give children. And it doesn't. Okay? Now, I neglected to mention, in Rahu Dasha, because Rahu can always give relationship, always possibly give marriage. I should have jumped to the Saptamsha chart. And you'll see in the Saptamsha chart, Rahu is in great shape. In fact, if we look at this chart, the best planet for relationship in this chart is Venus, because it's exalted. The best planet. He's great. He's the strongest planet to give relationships. So actually, in the beginning of Rahu Dasha, they started having a relationship with someone. They started having a long-term relationship because of the fact that Rahu is going to give the effects of its Lord Venus, who's so strong. Okay? Now, Rahu Jupiter, though, came along, and because Jupiter's not in great shape in the Saptamsha, they didn't have children, nor did they get married. They didn't move towards anything really great. Okay? Things sort of remained as they were in Rahu. And didn't really move forward, which was a little frustrating. And, the frustration comes in because Jupiter is the 11th Lord, and, closing Rahu down. So Rahu can't keep moving smoothly down the road that he started in Rahu through his Lord Venus. Okay? Now, a planet will only give the biggest thing if it can, in its own, you only give something huge in the beginning of its dasha if it's really strong to do it. Okay, in this case, Rahu is, because Venus is exalted. But let's say Venus had been not exalted and not an own sign, it probably wouldn't have given a relationship in Rahu. It would have made him wait a little bit. Okay, so Rahu Jupiter, things don't really advance with that. Not much. Okay, but then Rahu Saturn comes along. Oh, let's also look at Jupiter in the Navamsha. I'm sorry. In the Navamsha, we see that Rahu and Jupiter both are in the 12th from the ascendant. So that's the houses of making some sacrifices, right? It's not the ideal house. Jupiter actually rules the 9th cusp. So there's a lot of energy and possibility for marriage under Jupiter, okay? But Jupiter is influenced by the Sun, which is good. But then he's aspected by Mars, which is good, sorry. But then he's aspected by Mercury and enemy and Venus and enemy. And see how Mercury and Venus are hurting Jupiter more? So they're starving Jupiter in the Navamsha. Saturn, he's in Saturn's sign, who's a natural neutral. So Jupiter is just getting too starved to make marriage happen in Rahu Jupiter. It's talked about, but doesn't completely happen. Okay? Then they go into Rahu Saturn. Okay? Now, in the Saptamsha chart, Saturn's not an ideal planet once again. Let's look at it. Rahu gives the results of Saturn, right? So an important period. Saturn's aspected by a strong sun to 32 points, which starves him. By the moon to 37 points, which starves him. By Mars, who's sleeping and can't starve him. By Mercury to 38 points, who's helping him. By Jupiter to 11 points, who's indifferent. By Venus, who's helping him, to 13 points, and it's an exalted Venus. But, so that looks really bad at first, but then we have to remember Saturn is in a watery sign, and so he gets thirsted, not starved, right? Just as Jupiter before him was in a watery sign, not starved by those troublesome influences, so he didn't help the relationship, but he didn't ruin it either. Saturn is starved. Not starved, sorry. He is thirsted, okay, by his enemy's sun and moon. Mars can't really thirst him much because Mars is sleeping, but he's thirsted by sun and moon. But then he gets a lot of help by Mercury and Venus, which gives him some mudita. So he's okay in the Saptamsha. He's not great. He's somewhat thirsted, but he has some mudita, some rejoicing on him too. So there's he's a mediocre relationship planet. Okay? Now in the Navamsha, Rahu Saturn's particularly important for many reasons. First, Rahu Saturn's always important. Second, Saturn rules Rahu. It's the ruler of Rahu. Third, Saturn rules Jupiter, a planet that Rahu's conjunct. Okay? Fourth, Saturn rules Venus, the Karaka of marriage, the Karaka planet of marriage, or of the Navamsha. So Saturn is really, really focused in this Navamsha. It's a very important planet. Saturn's aspected by a strong enemy sun, so you get some starvation there. Aspected by a strong moon, get starvation there. Aspected by Mars, who's relatively strong. Then he's aspected by Mercury, who helps, and Venus, who helps. And he's in a friend sign, in Mercury sign, in a natural friend sign, which luckily that was there, otherwise would have been really bad. So as it is, Saturn is mediocre in the Navamsha. He has a lot of starvation, but he has enough mudita, delight, to make things happen. So they actually marry in Rahu Saturn. Okay, at the beginning of Rahu Saturn, they get married. And you can just see how this Saturn rules the ninth lord Jupiter, Rahu the Dasha lord, the fifth cusp, which is the ninth from the ninth, the second house of marriage in the Navamsha, and the Karaka Venus. It's just so focused on wanting to get married. It's such a marriage-centered planet. But it's just so-so. So they get married, and right away they realize that marriage was not going to be as enjoyable as they thought it was going to be. They thought they were going to get married, they were going to spend every spare moment with their husband, and that would be what their life focused on. At the time, they were 23 years old, okay? They thought, that's what my life is going to be. It's going to revolve around my husband. So they go on their honeymoon. The weekend after, their first weekend after the honeymoon, husband wakes up and says, I'm going to go do this. What are you going to do? See you tonight. And just Saturday morning walks out of the house to do his own thing. And she was just flabbergasted that, geez, I was planning on spending my weekend with you. But he didn't have those same plans. And that's sort of what her marriage was like. So it didn't really provide the anchoring path of existence that she hoped it would. It left her with a lot of starvation of trying to figure out what to do with her life. But it was still good enough because it was so focused on marriage. When you see a planet that's completely focused on marriage or anything, but it has some problems, the person gets into it, but they don't have the happiness. They're starved. But marriage happens in Rahu Saturn. Okay? Then they go into Rahu Mercury period. Mercury, how important is Mercury going to be? Well, in the Rashi chart, Mercury is not really related to Rahu strongly. Okay? Let's see, it's somewhere here. Okay, it is. Okay, sorry. I was just looking for it. Rahu gives the results of Mars, because he's in Mars' sign, and Mercury rules Mars. So Mercury is the ruler of Mars. So they both have a Mars agenda going on. Okay? But it's a tricky one to look for and find. Well, what's Mars' agenda? Second house, Rahu, and Jupiter. Well, there's Jupiter again and Rahu again. Let's go to the Saptamsha. And that might have been a hard Varga to guess that you needed to look at. So it's always good to check all Vargas, because sometimes it can be a little tricky to figure out what the important Varga is. Okay? Jupiter's the Karaka of children. Mercury rules the ninth, the fifth from the fifth, the house of children. And of course, Mercury, in women's chart, ninth house especially can get them geared towards children. So that makes us think we should probably look at the Saptamsha. Now in the Saptamsha, Rahu's sitting really nicely for children because its Lord is exalted. Okay. In the Saptamsha, Mercury happens to be the Lord of the fifth Rashi, so it's supportive, opening influences. So it opens Rahu up to children. Mercury rules Mars, who's the 11th Lord, which is an important house for giving the birth of children. It's the fifth from the 11th. The children are fifth of the seventh. the children of your partner, which is your children too. It rules Mars. It's interchanged with Mars between the 11th cusp and the second cusp. So you see that interchange? And that's a very important interchange. Second and 11th cusp interchange could be gain a family, you know, taking care of the responsibilities of that Varga, in this case, Saptamsha, which is children, and being responsible for your sexual activities. Mercury's in pretty good shape. He's in a natural neutral sign. He's aspected by Mars, who's in neutral, so it doesn't matter. He's helped by his friend Venus, and then he's indifferent by Saturn. Okay, then he's hurt by the moon. Okay, he's conjunct the moon, so he's always starred by the moon a little bit. Okay, but he is from the ascendant. He opens up Rahu. Rahu can't wait to have children because his Lord Venus is strong. He rules the 11th Lord Mars and has that interchange. So they have a child in Rahu Mercury. Okay? And you can see this isn't a beautiful Mercury. It rules the 8th sign from the ascendant. Okay? Which always indicates a little intrigue. So it was a little bit unexpected. They weren't planning on having the child. But Rahu Mercury is still able to give a child. Also of importance to note is that from Rahu, Mercury rules Mars, the 7th Lord, the Lord of Conception, and the 9th Lord, counting Rashis here, which is the Lord of, the 9th, the Lord of a children's house again, okay? So there's some secondary indications to Rashi positions too. But the most important reason for Mercury giving the child, simply because it rules Mars, the 11th Lord, in the Saptamsha, and because it rules Mars in the Rashi as well. And Mars, of course, has a family child agenda because it rules Jupiter in the second house. So have a child in Rahu Mercury period. Okay? Then the next really critical period is going to be Rahu Venus period. That's always a huge make it or break it period in a person's life. Okay? It's rarely a happy period for relationships either, as I've mentioned. So as expected, Rahu Venus period comes along, and they're not really happy in their marriage life. And that we're going to see because of Venus being debilitated in the Rashi chart. Okay? In the Saptamsha, luckily, Venus is exalted and rules Rahu. So that gives them a big purpose to still have a relationship, even though in some ways she's not feeling happy married because Venus is debilitated in the Rashi chart. But it's beautiful in the Saptamsha, so it's easy to guess what happens, right? They have a child in Rahu Venus. Okay, so second child is born in Rahu Venus. Now, Rahu's in the second house, the house of family. And wherever Rahu is in Rahu Venus, it can hurt that house. So in Rahu Venus period, family gets hurt. But what family member is it? That's always a tough one to find out. Venus is one of the karakas of father. The sun is the other karaka of father. And they're both in the 12th house from the ascendant. Okay? So since it's the karaka of father, and we see a possible family stuff, and Venus is conjunct the other karaka father of sun, that tells us we need to pay attention to parental stuff. Also, Rahu gives the results of Mars, who's sleeping and therefore hurting the 9th Baba, who's the parental influences, starting with the father influence. Okay, so we can see Rahu indicating some possible trouble to the parental influence of the father, and the parental influence in general. And Rahu Venus is the karaka father, so is the sun. So that lets us know a person should pay attention to the Dwadasamsha, the parental chart, and see what's going on there. Well, there, Rahu is sitting in Leo, where it's going to give the results of the fifth bhava cusp, which is the ninth from the ninth, therefore second house of father. His lord, the sun, is doing okay. He's in a natural friend sign, or natural neutral sign. His friend Mars helps him out. His enemy Saturn doesn't hurt him because Saturn's sleeping in Leo. And Jupiter helps him out just a little. No, it doesn't. It's Jupiter sleeping too. Okay. Then Rahu is going to give the results of Saturn in general in the Dwadasamsha. Saturn rules the 9th and 10th cusp, and Saturn is sleeping. So there we see Rahu's not really liking the father. And of course, the Karaka father, Venus, is debilitated. Okay. It's conjunct, or it's not conjunct, I'm sorry. It's debilitated. And it's not a good thing. Karaka father debilitated in both charts. So Rahu, Venus, the father dies. Okay. Rahu's going to give the results of Saturn, who's sleeping, and Venus is sleeping too. And of course, this trouble started long before in Rahu-Saturn period, because Saturn is the 9th and 10th lord sleeping in Leo. So there was actually, some serious problems to the father's health in Rahu-Saturn. But Rahu-Venus, he actually died. And that's such a critical period, Rahu-Venus, when troublesome stuff can happen. So at the age of, early to mid-20s, the father dies. So relatively very early death of father because of this Rahu and this Venus in the Dwadasamsha. Okay. Now, predicting death to relatives, really we should, if we want to try to predict that, we should look at lots of things. By looking at the Dwadasamsha, it's letting us see that there's going to be some serious problems with the parental influence of the father in Rahu Venus. That doesn't necessarily mean the death, though. Okay? It's a likelihood or possibility of death. It's a certainty of lack of parental influence. But there's a lot of ways to lose a parent without them dying. You could just get in an argument, never ever talk to them. You can get disowned, whatever. In this case, it was actually death. That was the big part of the picture. Okay? To judge that, we have to look at a lot of other Vargas as well. And it's bigger work. Okay? The place to start with that would be the health of the father, as counted from the Rashi that rules the father, which in this case is Cancer. 10th Bhavakas rules the well-being of the father. Rahu is in the 5th from there, conjunct Jupiter, the 6th lord. So we can see that Rahu has some possibilities of giving sickness to the father. Okay, 3rd cusp here is the 6th cusp from the father. And any malefics that join the 6th lord can always can potentially kill you in their period. The 6th lord rarely will kill you in its dasha for some reason. Malefics joining the 6th like to kill you more. Okay, figure that. So 6th lord Jupiter, from the 10th we're talking, is joined Rahu. Then, from the 9th cusp, the cusp of parental influences, Rahu's conjunct the 7th lord Jupiter. And of course, the 7th lord is always a possible death-inflicting planet, and malefics conjunct that are a death-inflicting planet. And Rahu's a malefic conjunct that 7th lord, giving the results of Mars, who happens to be sleeping in the 9th house. So you can see how this Rahu is not well situated for the father. And it's in the 2nd house of family. Okay? But we see things pointing towards the father dying. Sure, it could have happened in Rahu Saturn, Rahu Mars, Rahu many things. But Venus is debilitated in the Rashi and the Dwadasamsha. So it makes sense for the parent to have died in Rahu Venus, which is when they died. Okay? Okay, so the father died in Rahu Venus. And they had the birth of a child. In fact, the father died 3 weeks after the child was born. Okay? Okay, then, Okay, so those are the sort of the highlight events in Rahu period. Marriage, birth of 2 children, and death of the father. Okay, destruction of family members, Rahu in the 2nd house. Okay. One other thing, did I want to mention that? Let's see. No, that's all good. Okay, so that gives you an idea how we can approach one chart. This person hasn't had their Ketu Dasha and will never have their Ketu Dasha. They'll expire before Ketu Dasha comes. So we don't have any examples of Ketu. However, you do always want to look at Rahu Ketu Dasha. It's always an important period, Rahu Ketu, Ketu Rahu, because they're opposites and they sort of work together. So in Rahu Ketu period is always a period where it helps a person sort of let go of Ketu in such a way as to hopefully advance Rahu. Because again, Ketu is where we're sort of practiced and used to it, and Rahu is what we're trying to develop. So in Rahu Ketu, we sort of finish up some Ketu things so we can put a bigger emphasis on Rahu things. Okay? This person's Rahu is in the 2nd house, the house of their personal resources and finances, and Rahu wants to develop them. But they're kind of hung up on Ketu of benefiting from other people's resources and finances, Ketu in the 2nd house, or 8th house in Taurus. Ketu is going to give the results of Venus, who's debilitated in the 12th sign from the ascendant, which is bad, right? Ketu is not going to be good for other people's income and stuff. Okay? So, in Rahu Ketu, Ketu starts to disrupt their finances that they get from their spouse, meaning their spouse, earns less money during that time because Venus is debilitated, spends more money during that time as well because Venus is in the 12th. And as a result, they become encouraged to want to focus on their own wealth more. They're kind of stuck in Ketu during Ketu period, and they're frustrated that financially they're not doing as good as they want to because their spouses, they're not getting the money they hope they're used to, and that Ketu's used to getting from their spouse, okay, from partners and other people. So that's a period that's a bit frustrating financially as a result. Okay? And that encourages Rahu to want to become more financially secure. Not that that's going to happen during Ketu, but Ketu sort of gives things, resolves things, helps them make up their mind about things and get more determined about things that Rahu wants to focus on. So it helps to complete their need to, sort of have things taken care of by other people through other people's money, and through that stir up a greater desire to be self-sufficient financially on their own, Rahu in the 2nd house. Okay? Now, sometimes you'll see that Ketu's in really great shape, and his Lord's in really great shape, and that can indicate a Rahu Ketu period where a person gets some, good karmic, boon or something, some good stuff falls into their lap that makes Rahu less tedious, meaning, let's say Venus was exalted in this person's chart. Then when Rahu Ketu comes, there's a financial boon that happens due to their marriage, and as a result, they don't have to worry that much during Rahu Ketu about their own resources and the money they make personally. But that wasn't the case here, because Ketu is in bad shape. They really have to focus on taking care of things through Rahu, because when Ketu fails, all we have is Rahu, right? And when Rahu fails, all we have is Ketu. When Ketu does great, we don't have to worry about Rahu. We worry about Rahu when Ketu fails us. Otherwise, we're happy to keep Ketu. This is a case where Ketu failed them, and so Rahu was under greater need of being developed. Okay? And this person's life, Ketu is always going to fail them. They're always going to feel a little shortchanged from what they get from other people, from the meaning and purpose they get in their relationships. 8th house is the financial, emotional needs met from their relationships. And those always being a little bit less than they expect with that Ketu there. That'll force them to want to develop Rahu more, which is develop their own resources and own emotional security, Rahu being in Scorpio. Okay? And that's where their whole life sort of been heading. Okay? All right. Okay, I think that's good for that example of Rahu and